Central to my work was the notion of a global cataclysm, roughly 12,500, 12,800 years ago. It made sense to me in 1995 when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, but there was no compelling evidence for a global cataclysm then. All the evidence seemed to point to that time and a massive global event. And then from 2007 onwards, more than a decade after I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, we get a group of more than 60 major scientists who are seriously proposing that the Earth was hit by multiple fragments of a giant comet 12,800 years ago, and that this caused a huge rise in sea level and extinctions of megafaunas. They are not saying that it also wiped out a lost advanced civilization of prehistory. I'm saying that.
Yes.
But what has changed is that we now have compelling, hard scientific evidence. I'm not saying every scientist accepts it. It's the nature of science to dispute findings, but we have a group of 60 major figures who have seriously proposed this in all the leading mainstream journals, and it's changed the balance of power in this argument, because one thing that they used to say is Hancock can't be right because there was no global cataclysm 12 or 13,000 years ago. Well, now we know there was, and there are various explanations for it, so that's moved things along. And the other thing that's changed a lot is the attitude of the man in the street to authority. That has changed. Back in the 90s, authority figures were the gatekeepers. They controlled everything. If an authority figure in a discipline like archaeology said Hancock is completely wrong, he's made all this stuff up, that would generally be believed, not by everybody, but by the majority of people. Today, to have a mainstream authority figure say that to me is actually an advantage, because people are so distrustful of authority, and rightly so, because we've been lied to by authority figures in all fields for so long. The bullshit has been so enormous that people are finally waking up, and we can't trust what authority figures say. And
I think we can thank the internet for that.
We can thank the internet for that, yeah.
I'm sure you've seen the more recent evidence of a crater that they just discovered, like fairly recently.
Greenland.
Yes,
yeah.
Enormous crater.
It's an enormous crater. It's 18 miles wide. It had not been discovered before because it's under ice. It's under a lot of ice. At the end of the Ice Age, Greenland was one area which never lost its ice cover completely, whereas North America, everywhere north of Minnesota, was covered in ice a mile, sometimes 2 miles deep. Europe, the same, Northern Europe. But Greenland kept its ice, whereas the other parts of the world lost their ice at the end of the Ice Age. And what's interesting about Greenland is there's already evidence of comet impact in Greenland, which goes back to papers published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013, that they found what are called impact proxies in Greenland. In other words, nanodiamonds, carbon spherules, and evidence of a lot of platinum and iron was found in a layer in the ice dated to 12,800 years ago. But the next development, and you're absolutely right, and this was just a few months ago, was the discovery of this humongous crater in Greenland, and evidence that it was caused by an iron impactor of some kind. Now, dating of it, I would be irresponsible to say that that crater definitely dates to 12,800 years ago, because the work has not been done to prove that yet. But what I can say, and what the specialists who have explored and excavated the crater are saying, is that it's recent. They can say for sure that it happened during the last ice age. Under the crater is nothing but massively disturbed and destroyed and completely wrecked ice from the Ice Age, from the Pleistocene. Above it is smooth, perfect ice from our epoch, which is called the Holocene, which began about 11,600 years ago. So all the evidence suggests that this crater dates to that period between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. But to absolutely confirm that, more work needs to be done. But it's part of a growing pattern. The Younger Dryas impact scientists, they call themselves, they call this the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And it's because there was a period in the Earth's geological history that geologists call the Younger Dryas, which lasted for 1,200 years, from 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. It's a very mysterious period. We see all the megafauna dying off suddenly and rapidly. We see rises in sea level. We see a huge collapse in global temperature. It's a cataclysmic epoch, and what is becoming clearer and clearer is that the evidence that a comet was behind it is extremely strong. And as more and more evidence comes in, we realize how widespread it was. So they found evidence of the impacts as far south as Antarctica now. Previously, they were focused very much on North America. Now, as far south as Antarctica, as far east as Syria. This was truly a global event, and it changed the world. And I think, and it's my case, that it wiped our memory of a previous episode of human civilization, that right at the epicenter of this cataclysm was a civilization that we would regard as advanced, not a simple hunter-gatherer civilization, which was utterly wiped out in this cataclysmic event.
And I should say, for anyone who's really fascinated right now, please maybe pause and go listen to the two that you did with Randall Carlson,
yes,
where it really goes into depth about the impact, the evidence of these impacts, yes, the evidence of the very quick demise of the Ice Age, and what may have resulted in all these floods that you read about in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that you read about in Noah's Ark, and that all these things are probably tales of stories that people pass down from generation to generation that survived this time.
Yeah, because we now know that at that time, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, truly global cataclysmic events involving rapid rises in sea level did occur, and suddenly the worldwide tradition of a global flood stops being just a myth and starts being a memory, an account of real events. It's been my privilege to work very closely with Randall Carlson.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Randall is absolutely amazing. He is a total genius. He's also a gentle giant and such a kind, generous, spirited person. It's a joy to work with him, and every minute spent with him is an education. I had the privilege of traveling across the Channel Scablands in Washington State with Randall, and seeing things through his eyes really opened my eyes to the scale of this disaster. You know, you could look at these giant boulders called glacial erratics, and they just look odd sitting there in the landscape, but when you really consider how they got there, that they got there in icebergs the size of oil tankers, that were carried on floods that were at least 500 up to 1,000 feet deep, that were tearing through the channeled scablands, literally ripping the landscape apart. Then the icebergs would ground on valley sides, the flood waters would recede, the icebergs would be left, they're giant icebergs, and as they melted away, they revealed the rocks that they had enchained that were caught up within them, and they're scattered all over the landscape. And you look at that and you think, anything that was underneath that 12,800 years ago is gone completely. There can't be anything left of it at all. Utterly, utterly destroyed.
And I would encourage people that are interested in this to please watch the YouTube videos of it, because Randall provides all sorts of video and photographic evidence where you can take a look at the landscape and you get a perspective of how immense this destruction was.
Yeah, it's really important to see that, because it's easy enough to talk about floods and cataclysms, but actually to see its effect on the landscape directly it has an emotional impact. I felt emotional traveling across the Channel Scablands, realizing that this was the heart of an event that changed the world completely. And the evidence continues to build. In America before, I've not gone over old ground that I went over in Magicians of the Gods, and that we covered in the various interviews and podcasts, in which it's really a good idea that people take a look at. But what I have done is added the new information published since 2015, which further supports the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and the notion that multiple fragments of a giant comet hit the Earth and created an absolute global catastrophe.